Hello and welcome to this Disability Training Resource Pack. My name is Kt Tupling and I am the Disability Advisor for Oxford Diocese. I'm an ambulant wheelchair user, which means that I use crutches most of the time, but sometimes when I need a bit more speed, I get my wheelchair out. My paid role involves advising the Oxford Diocese on disability awareness and inclusion, a diocese that covers the counties of Oxfordshire, Berkshire and Buckinghamshire. In a nutshell, my role is to provide support, experience and expertise in policies and practices of inclusion of those with disabilities across the spectrum of disability and marginalisation. And in this video, we're thinking specifically about disability and church buildings. Many churches in some of their literature use the words welcome, accessibility, inclusion and belonging quite freely. So how do they stand up to scrutiny in the light of disability and our experiences? Fiona Macmillan at the Heart Edge Project talked about moving from getting in to joining in with all of these aspects, going beyond ramps and toilets and tea loops and actually belonging to the body of Christ where the body of Christ meets. So here are some practical solutions to some of the stumbling blocks of church buildings. Let's begin with parking, if you're lucky enough to have somewhere where people can park on your site. Disabled bays with things in them that should not be there, something other than a car. So recycling bins in this particular disabled bay on screen, or disabled bays that have been marked as such, but are simply not wide enough. We don't fit in standard width car parking spaces. We need the extra space around them to get doors open and to get boots open for wheelchairs and other bits of equipment. Sometimes there are bollards at the end of car parking spaces, and that simply just won't do. What is ideal is tarmac and hatchings all around the car footprint so that whichever door we're getting out of, whether we're the driver or the passenger, we can access that space. Clearly marked disabled bays. Put a sign up on the wall if you can do, or on a post, and paint something on the tarmac itself, but wide enough for all the doors to be opened fully. How about pathways? So supposing we can arrive under public transport or in our own cars, can we now be met with a path we can get along easily? More often than not, the answer is no. Gravel. There's an awful lot of gravel knocking about the place, and loose gravel is particularly hazardous for crutches, for wheelchairs, for buggies, for scooters, walking sticks, anything that aids us to get along a path. When it comes across gravel, we immediately dig in. It's not good. Loose gravel is hopeless for medical equipment and mobility aids, and also for guide dogs and assistance dogs and their paws. It's not a nice substance. Also making sure that your paths are wide enough with no tight turns and narrow edges. How about, if you've got gravel, getting it compacted and resin bound? A simple process to do. At Church of England, you will need a faculty for this, everything does, but it is a simple solution to an existing problem. Make sure that you edge the pathways with a contrasting colour. So a grey edge to a beigey colour gravel, as we have in the images here. Have low lighting that lights the path rather than lighting the air around the path. If you have flagstones, can you make sure that they are trip-free and pressure washed for the resin that comes off of trees? If you need to redress your flagstones, then please go to the expense of doing so. What we're after is not necessarily level access, but step-free access with a minimum gradient. In law, the minimum gradient is a 1:9 ratio. That does assume that someone is being pushed in a wheelchair rather than doing it themselves. 1:12, 1:15, absolute bliss if you're a manual wheelchair user, self-propelling. What's next? We can park, we can now get in. Well, we can get to the door, but what are our doorways like? For example, this Victorian building has 30 well-worn stone steps to get up there with intermittent handrails that go around the iron railings and gates. There is a lift, but it's behind industrial bins with no signage, and it's locked access. You can't go in the lift unless someone is with you for, I'm told, insurance and safeguarding reasons. I'm curious to know, if you were the first person to arrive on site as a wheelchair user, how you get in. You can retrofit handrails and have them done well. You can also retrofit push buttons to doors so they open automatically. You can retrofit pretty much anything to anything. It does, of course, require faculty and some funding, but it's worth it for the dignity and agency of people being able to get in by themselves. So we've parked, we've come along the pathway, we've got in through the door. What are we met with inside in terms of furniture? Usually pews. Pews are tricky because they give no option or choice for people who are using wheelchairs. They restrict seating and access for anyone with mobility or back or joint problems. They can be major trip hazards, and you can't move them to improve sight lines. They also restrict agency. If you've made a space for wheelchairs to sit in, then you've said to that person, you will sit here. No choice, no agency, and often the space isn't big enough. People tend to measure manual wheelchairs. They don't tend to measure power chairs, which are substantially bigger. A good example is where a clean, flat space has been created with movable furniture. Much better. Level access, step and trip free, that can adapt to sight lines in any building and gives you a multi-use space, not just restricted to an hour on Sunday for worship. In the image on screen, I would have liked to have seen a bit more contrast in the colour between the floor and the seats. It's all a little bit beige, a little bit mushroomy colour, and you can't necessarily differentiate between the seating and the flooring. And perhaps the seating and the flooring could have had a better arrangement so you can see an aisle path from the main door up to the chancel. Perhaps you could have coloured the floor slightly differently. So we can park, we can get to the door, we can get through the door, we can access the inside space. How about toilets? Toilets. If you're lucky enough to have internal plumbing and toilets in your church building, that is a huge bonus. If you're able to have the footprint to have a wheelchair accessible space, that's also a bonus. If you have that space, please don't store things in that toilet space that should not be there. All you need in a room designated accessible toilet is a toilet, a sink, and a mirror, and something to dry your hands on. Storing your communion wine boxes in that space is an absolute no-no. Number one, bit weird. Number two, that's not what that space is there for. Also, don't tie up your emergency pull cords. If you have one, again, you can retrofit emergency pull cords. It's a simple thing to do, but don't tie them up in the air. If we've landed on the floor and need to call for help, the cord needs to touch the floor. Having a handrail on the back of the door to be able to get in and out easily is brilliant. Having a hook on the door is fantastic. Having a hook at a level where a wheelchair user can reach is also fantastic. So if you've got one at standing height, put another one on at seated height. A really great example on screen is a church in Littlemore in Oxford who redid their disabled toilet. Includes clutter-free, a sliding or pocket door, colour contrasts, grab rails, paper towels, because not all of us appreciate being blasted to death by a hand dryer, a baby change facility that flips up against the wall so stays out of the way for the footprint, and a large turning circle accommodating wheelchairs, pushchairs, buggies, and power chairs. On the day I visited, their emergency cord was tied up, so a memory to the cleaner and whoever goes in there to make sure that it's untied afterwards. And interestingly enough, the toilet flush was in the far corner, so you had to reach over the toilet to get to it. If you've transferred back into your chair, it's a long reach to be able to flush the loo. I kind of wish someone had thought of that before they signed off on the build. So we've done all of that. Now we're in the space, we are refreshed, we are content, and we're asked to lead, or we're part of the leadership of the worship service. And believe it or not, there's quite a few disabled clergy and local lay ministers or readers, however you might call them in your diocese. There's a whole load of us around the place with different physical disabilities and neurodiversities. So we're at the front being invited to lead. And what we discover is a series of steps to get to the chancel. A lot of development projects deal with the congregation accessibility, but not with the leadership from the front, and certainly not sacramental accessibility. This far, but no further. This church decided to take out the steps to the chancel and realign to make it a sloped access using the original materials and placing a gentle gradient. Pretty much doable anywhere, which means anyone can get to the chancel. Interestingly enough, sometimes when you can get there and steps have been removed, what you discover, you've still got a lectern on a plinth, and that is where everything is done from. Questions here would be, can the lectern come off the plinth? Can the plinth be removed? Or perhaps can we just use a handheld mic and a simple mobile way of doing the intercessions, the preaching, the leading, whatever is needed? How about the environment, the space? I'm grateful to Anne Memmert for the first image on screen, which is showing you what it might be like for someone who is autistic, has some kind of neurodivergence in terms of environmental stuff. A sensory overstimulus caused by light or sound can be completely overwhelming, and a person cannot stay in that space. So think about your lighting, think about your sound, consistency and continuity of both, not too bright, not too dark. You don't want to make it too dark for people who have got sight loss issues, but to be able to say, can people comfortably be in this space, or is the environment going to make them leave? Talking of sound systems, if you have one, does it work? If you have a T loop or an induction loop, is it up to date? An awful lot of people's hearing aids now are using Bluetooth. So are you up to date with modern technology? If you have a mic, are people actually using it? Too often I get large, loud men saying, I'm loud, I don't need a microphone. Well, yes, you do. When we raise our voices or shout louder, it distorts our lip patterns. And a lot of people who are losing their hearing but haven't realized this are now relying on lip reading and haven't realized that either. When people get loud, something is lost in translation. When people cover their mouths as they're talking, something gets lost in translation. And gentlemen with large bushy beards, try and make sure you can still see your mouth. Because again, people who are losing their hearing and haven't realized and are now relying on lip reading more than they had before cannot see what you're saying. Font sizes on our printed material. Too small. Print extra pages to make the font bigger. A lack of awareness around clear print guidelines. The RNIB also have a very good set about guidelines in terms of printed material and projected material. A lack of color contrast, trying to put faded something on pastel backgrounds where there's no contrast between the background and the font, and imposing words over images, which makes the whole thing a fudge to be able to see. The use of block capitals in printed material. Block capitals are really hard if you are dyslexic. It gives you no word shape at all. So please try to avoid using block capitals. Agency. You see, what's missing is a conversation with disabled people. Quite often, adaptations and developments and redevelopments are done with all the best meaning in the world, but no consultation. For example, this is called the Stramp. This is a sequence and series of intersecting ramps and stairs to raise everybody up and down quite a large drop. The idea is great, and it was supposedly designed for those with accessibility needs. However, most of us in the disabled world have said, oh my goodness, no. This has been done at disabled people and not done with. Wheelchair users will lose it on the ramps going downhill and end up on the steps. And even uphill is a very long push, even with these supposed hairpin platforms, and there are hairpins. Anyone using crutches? Well, we don't have all the way continuous handrails, and where we do, they're meeting people coming up the other way on literal blind corners. Anyone with dyspraxia or sight loss has no indication as to where the ramps or steps or level access begin and ends. It all blurs into one. There are no safety rail edges for wheels on the edge of the edges of the ramps. This is very much a done at and not done with. My solution would have been keep the steps and put 2 lifts in so that if one lift breaks down, you've still got the other one. We don't do this as church, though, do we? We don't impose these things on people with our buildings, our locations, our liturgy, our vocations, and our leadership teams and our ministry. We don't end up with a similar version of the Stramp in all of these aspects of church life. The key, as I said, is done with, not done at. This great infograph talks about things done to people, things done for people, not ideal, things done with people and by people is absolutely ideal. Remember the 1960s clarion call by the disability rights movement, nothing about us without us. So in all of our buildings, through the lens of disability, if we're going to say welcome, if we're going to say we're accessible, if we're going to include people in order that everyone may belong, then any adaptations and stumbling blocks that need to be made or removed should be done with and not at. So pause to reflect. What do you understand by welcome, accessibility, inclusion, and belonging? What are the challenges of each of those in your own context? Where have you experienced good or poor practice? And how might you adjust your own practice and your own building in the light of what we've been thinking about in this video? Have a pause, have a think, and then come back and look again at some resources. So here are some resources to think about in terms of websites, materials, and books. 2 really helpful documents that you might want to consider looking at. One is a simple access audit for use by wardens and small working groups. You can find this and a lot of other resources on the Oxford Diocese Disability page. And this is a narrative audit. It asks questions rather than ticking boxes. So you get to describe and design and wonder about what you currently have and what you might want to aim for. The other thing is a document called Equal Access, produced by the Church Buildings Council and downloadable from the Church of England website. A really helpful walk through what it means to interact and engage with DACs, Diocesan Advisory Committees, on making significant changes to your buildings. A variety of websites to help think more broadly about disability, looking at different models of disability, the emergence of the disabled people's movement in the UK, the consultation around online, on-site and hybrid church from the perspective of disabled, deaf and neurodivergent people. Something about the Church Buildings Council about redevelopment of churches, of course, and part of the Heart Edge series, Shut In, Shut Out, Shut Up, looking particularly at ableism, faith and church. And then some books. At the Gates by Naomi Lawson-Jacobs and Emily Richardson. My Body Is Not a Prayer Request by Amy Kenny. Loving Our Own Bones by Julia Watts-Belser. Worship and Disability by myself and Anna Delage. Being Disabled, Being Human by me. And a collaboration, Pilgrims in the Dark, written by members of Disability and Jesus. If you want to get hold of me, my contact details are on screen. Thank you for watching.